right, let's jump right in. Today's deep dive west, well, we're heading out west to a city that basically went from 0 to 60 in the blink of an eye, reshaping America along the way.
Yeah.
Chicago. Now, get this, we're diving into historical accounts, economic analyses, heck, we even unearthed some personal letters.
You know, what always blows me away about Chicago is how its impact, it wasn't confined to just its city limits. I mean, it was like this ripple effect, right? It reached across the entire West and ended up influencing everything, how people lived, how they worked, even their relationship to the land itself, all stemming from this one city. It's remarkable.
It's almost hard to wrap your head around when you think about it. I mean, early Chicago, from the pictures I've seen, it was just this tiny little settlement surrounded by prairies. Prairies that look like they went on forever. Can you imagine being one of the first people to see that and think, yeah, this is the place to be?
You know, you wouldn't be alone in that. Because even some of Chicago's earliest supporters, the people who were absolutely convinced it was destined for greatness, even they couldn't have possibly imagined the scale of what it would eventually become.
But that's where things get interesting, because then came what I can only describe as the ultimate hype machine. Like, take everything we know about modern marketing and times it by 1,000. Am I right?
Oh, absolutely. We're talking about booster rhetoric here. Think about it this way. Imagine all those tech startups today, the ones that promise you the world with their latest app, their new gadget. Well, Chicago's boosters, they were doing the same thing, but on a way bigger scale. They weren't just selling a product. They were selling a vision of the future. And it was a vision grander than most folks thought possible.
And they weren't exactly shy about it either, right? I mean, comparing Chicago to ancient Rome, claiming it was destined for some kind of greatness. Were they serious?
Oh, they were dead serious. And that hype, that almost delusional optimism, believe it or not, that's actually what fueled real action. It attracted investors. It drew in these super ambitious individuals. It's like they were literally willing this city into existence.
But it wasn't all smoke and mirrors, though, was it? I mean, Chicago did have some real geographical advantages. That had to count for something, right?
It definitely did. Location, 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 right. I can't underestimate that. Chicago was near the Great Lakes, but also near the Mississippi River system, which basically meant they had access to this unbelievable network of waterways, which, as we know, were like the arteries of commerce back then. But, and this is important, those advantages alone, they wouldn't have been enough.
Okay, so what was the real game changer then? What was it that tipped the scales and made Chicago, Chicago?
2 words. The railroad. When the railroad arrived in the 1850s, it completely, and I mean completely, transformed Chicago's destiny. It was no longer about just being near waterways. It was about being that crucial link between the Eastern and the Western rail networks. Chicago was perfectly positioned.
So suddenly, this city that was basically on the periphery of everything becomes the essential connection for all those goods flowing between the East Coast, which was established, and the West, which, let's face it, was still developing, right?
Exactly. It's the perfect example, and we see this time and again throughout history, but it's a perfect example of how a place that might seem peripheral, a place on the edge of 2 major systems, can actually become the center of power. It's almost counterintuitive, isn't it?
You know, this is where it gets really interesting to me, and this is where the story of Chicago starts to feel, well, very American. And I want to talk about grain, because our sources describe these vast, fertile prairies all around Chicago, which are, of course, perfect for growing wheat and corn. But those early farmers, I have a feeling they weren't exactly living the easy life.
Oh, not at all. No, it was incredibly difficult. Imagine this. You're a farmer, you're surrounded by these endless grasslands, which means you have very limited access to timber. And timber, as you know, is essential for building. Then try to imagine transporting your crops before the railroad existed. I mean, it was a logistical nightmare. You were completely at the mercy of the seasons and the elements. It was tough.
And that's where innovation comes in, right?
Yeah.
Because that's when grain elevators came onto the scene. And these weren't just about storage either. This was about efficiency on a scale they had never seen before. Talk about game changers.
They were absolutely game changers because before elevators, you were stuck. Literally stuck, hauling these small loads of grain. Whatever you could physically transport yourself, that was it. That was your limit. And then suddenly these massive structures pop up, and almost overnight, they connect these farmers to this enormous, and I mean enormous, network. Now, their grain, it could be graded instantly. It could be sold on this global market. It was a complete game changer.
It sounds like it was an economic earthquake disguised as a building.
That's a good way to put it. And to make things even better, from a business perspective at least, Chicago embraced this technology wholeheartedly. They really went all in. And along with this standardized grading system that they implemented, grain elevators gave them this, well, this massive advantage over their rivals like St. Louis. It was becoming clear if you wanted to be in the grain game, Chicago was the place to be.
Okay, well, get ready, because this next part blew my mind when I read about it.
Yeah.
We're talking about grain futures. Now, we're not just talking about buying and selling actual grain anymore. We're talking about trading contracts for future delivery of grain. It's like they were betting on the future of bread.
It's true. And you know what? It completely revolutionized how grain was bought, sold, even perceived. I mean, this financial innovation took Chicago from a regional trading hub to a major player on the global stage almost overnight.
But like all booms, like we talked about, there's always a flip side, right?
Unfortunately, yes, that's the nature of the beast, isn't it? And our sources, they definitely highlight this darker side of the grain revolution. We're talking about market manipulation, traders trying to corner the market to drive up prices, and of course the growing distrust between those rural farmers we were talking about and this new Chicago exchange, which seemed to be taking all the profit.
Yeah, I guess it's a good reminder that even the most amazing, groundbreaking innovations, they can have unintended consequences, can't they? And speaking of booms and busts and unintended consequences, that takes us to another industry that Chicago transformed: lumber. Because our sources, they paint this picture, this really vivid picture actually, of these incredible white pine forests that basically blanketed the entire upper Midwest. I mean, back then, they must have seemed endless.
They did seem endless. It's hard to imagine now, but back then it seemed like that resource would be there forever. And of course, Chicago, with its booming population and this insatiable need for new buildings, well, they had an appetite for lumber that seemed just as endless.
So how did they even begin to get all that lumber from these massive forests to the middle of a prairie? Because we're not talking about a few trees here. We're talking about an operation on an epic scale.
It really was an epic scale. And to be honest, it was a logistical marvel. I mean, they were moving millions and millions of board feet of lumber from these often remote forests to the middle of Chicago. It took a lot of ingenuity, and it really required them to harness the power of nature itself. We're talking about rivers, dams, and eventually, of course, railroads. It was an incredible feat. And, you know, it wasn't just about moving the lumber either. You have to think about the money involved. Chicago Capital, all those investors we talked about, they were the ones financing every single stage of the lumber operation. I mean, from the moment those massive trees were felled to the moment the finished lumber arrived in Chicago, they were involved every step of the way.
Wow, so they weren't just buying lumber. They were basically controlling the whole supply chain. Talk about market dominance. But this couldn't last forever, could it? Mother Nature always has other plans, doesn't she?
She sure does. And eventually, the white pine forests, the ones that everyone thought would last forever, well, they started to dwindle. It's a classic story, really. Overexploitation, unsustainable practices. Chicago's demand for lumber was enormous, and in a way, they contributed to their own boom and bust cycle. It's kind of a cautionary tale, isn't it?
It really is. And speaking of booms and busts, well, that takes us to yet another industry that Chicago transformed: meat packing. Try to wrap your head around this. Millions of cattle and hogs being funneled into this one city, making it, at the time, the meatpacking capital of the world. How did that even happen?
You know, it's a really interesting story, and it all boils down to timing and opportunity. You see, the decline of the bison on the Great Plains, which is a whole other story, coincided perfectly with the rise of cattle ranching. So suddenly you have this void, this massive need for, well, meat. And Chicago never wanted to miss an opportunity. They were ready.
They didn't just fill the void. They reinvented the entire system. I mean, refrigerated rail cars meant that beef from Chicago wasn't just feeding the city, it was feeding the nation, the world. That's insane. And you have to think about it. That changed everything. Diets, the way land was used, even international trade. It's mind-boggling.
It really is. And at the center of it all was the Union Stockyards, which became this symbol, really, of Chicago's incredible power to innovate. But, and this is a point worth emphasizing, this transformation, just like the lumber boom, it wasn't without its, let's say, ethical complexities.
Right, because our sources definitely don't shy away from that aspect of the story. They talk about the brutal working conditions in the stockyards, the problems they had with waste disposal, and this growing disconnect, this gap, really, between the people who were consuming all this meat and, you know, the actual source of their food. It sounds eerily familiar, doesn't it?
It
reminds you of the debate today about things like factory farming. It's like, this isn't just history, it's a conversation we're still having today, but now it's playing out on our plates.
You hit the nail on the head. And honestly, that's what makes this deep dive so fascinating to me, because we're not just uncovering the past, we're also getting a glimpse, I think, of how the past continues to shape the present. And in some cases, it's like we're still grappling with the same dilemmas, aren't we?
Absolutely. Now, let's pull back for a moment and look at the bigger picture here, because Chicago's influence, it went way beyond these individual industries, right? We're talking about this massive network of trade and finance that they established, this network that basically stretched across the entire West. What was it about Chicago, do you think, that allowed them to do that? Where did that ambition, that drive come from?
Well, it's interesting because I think a lot of it goes back to that booster rhetoric we talked about earlier, that almost grandiose vision they had of Chicago as the metropolis of the West. And for a long time, it probably seemed like just that grandiose talk. But the thing is, it wasn't just talk. It had this real lasting impact because those pronouncements, those bold claims about Chicago's destiny, well, they worked. People bought into the hype. They attracted investors from all over the place, investors who were willing to pour their money into the city, especially into infrastructure projects like railroads. They were literally building the connections that would turn Chicago into that hub they had always envisioned.
So, in a way, the hype created its own reality. It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy, isn't it? But this wasn't just about connecting to the West for Chicago, was it? It was about being the gateway, that essential link between the East and the West. They were the bridge.
Precisely. Think about it. You have all these Eastern manufacturers, and they desperately want access to these vast growing markets of the West, but they need a reliable way to get their products there, which wasn't easy at the time. Chicago, with its rapidly expanding rail network, well, they became that crucial link.
So Chicago wasn't just passively receiving goods from the West and then shipping them on. They were actively shaping the tastes, the desires of consumers across the entire region. It's like they were deciding what people bought, what they wore, what they put on their tables. They were the tastemakers, the trendsetters for the West.
That's a great way to put it. And to give you a concrete example of this, one of the sources we looked at talked about Cyrus McCormick and his invention, the mechanical reaper. This thing revolutionized grain harvesting, as you can imagine, and it was manufactured right there in Chicago. But here's the thing. Once it was built, Chicago's incredible network of agents, retailers, and of course that impressive transportation system, they used all of that to distribute the Reaper throughout the West. They were a well-oiled machine.
Okay, that's fascinating. So their influence wasn't just about moving physical goods. It was about spreading these new technologies and ideas that transformed the way people lived and worked. Chicago was at the heart of it all, the epicenter.
Exactly. And here's the crucial point. McCormick's Reaper, as brilliant an invention as it was, it wouldn't have had the same impact without Chicago. Chicago was the catalyst. Their infrastructure, their commercial networks, they acted like a multiplier, taking something innovative and amplifying its effects exponentially.
It's incredible when you think about it. And it wasn't just about physical goods either, because Chicago, they were also the gateway for something else that was essential.
Yeah, it's capital.
Right. I mean, those farmers who needed McCormick's Reaper,
Yeah.
they needed credit to buy it. Where was that credit coming from?
You know the answer to that. It was coming from Chicago's financial institutions, of course. They swooped right in. Credit, let's face it, it was the fuel that kept this entire expanding Western economy running. It allowed farmers to invest in these new technologies. It allowed those ambitious merchants to expand their operations. And most importantly, it allowed Chicago to solidify its position as the undisputed financial capital of the West. They were calling the shots.
One thing that really stood out in all the research was this idea of Chicago as not just a city, but as a central place. It wasn't just a city among many. It was the focal point, almost like the beating heart of this vast network of towns and villages. It's a powerful image, isn't it?
It really is. And it's essential if you want to understand Chicago's true impact. Just picture it. All these smaller towns, all these villages, all connected to and in many ways dependent on Chicago. Dependent on them for goods, for services, and crucially for access to those wider markets we talked about. They were all connected like spokes on a wheel with Chicago right there in the center.
So it wasn't just Chicago competing with other cities like St. Louis, for example. It was about this entire system, this network they had created. And Chicago, well, they were calling the shots, right? They were making the rules.
They were definitely in the driver's seat. And their influence, it was everywhere you looked. It was shaping everything. And I mean everything. The type of farm equipment people used, the newspapers they read, even down to the clothes they wore and the financial services they relied on. They were everywhere.
It's almost like they weren't just selling products. They were selling a vision, a way of life. They were creating these new desires, new wants, new needs. It's like the birth of modern consumerism, isn't it?
It absolutely is. And the perfect example of this, the one that really drives the point home, is the mail order catalog. Companies like Montgomery Ward and Sears, both based in Chicago, they completely revolutionized the concept of retail. Can you imagine offering this mind-boggling variety of goods that people could literally order from a catalog and have delivered straight to their doorstep? It's incredible.
It's mind-blowing. I mean, we're so used to online shopping today that we forget how revolutionary that must have seemed at the time. Imagine, you're living in some rural community, maybe hundreds of miles from the nearest big city, and suddenly you have access to the entire world through this catalog. It's like magic.
It was like magic. And we have to give credit where credit is due, because it wouldn't have been possible without Chicago. Without their central position within this complex network of railroads, postal services, and financial systems, it never would have worked. Those catalogs weren't just about selling goods. They were about connecting people, connecting communities across these vast distances. And they did it on a scale that was unheard of at the time.
And they were also, and I think this is important, they were also selling this vision of modernity, weren't they? It was like they were saying, this is what progress looks like.
Yeah.
This is what you could, it was aspirational.
Absolutely. It was marketing on a massive, almost subconscious level. But just like with so much of Chicago's story, this wave of progress, this idea of modernity, it wasn't always met with open arms. In fact, there was a growing sense of unease, a tension that ran very deep.
Right, that growing tension between the city and the countryside. Farmers, in many ways, they were the backbone of the entire system, but they began to feel like they were being exploited, that Chicago was getting rich at their expense. It was us versus them.
And that tension, that feeling of friction between urban and rural communities, well, that's a recurring theme throughout history, isn't it? City versus countryside, progress versus tradition. Chicago and the West, they were a microcosm of this much larger story, this conflict that was playing out on a national and in many ways on a global scale. It was the story of the times.
And this tension, it wasn't just theoretical, was it? It had very real consequences.
Right.
And a prime example of this is the world's Columbian Exposition, the famous Chicago World's Fair, which was held in 1893. Now, this was a massive event, a global event, really, and it was intended to be this grand celebration of progress. They wanted to showcase the achievements of industry, technology, culture, all the things that Chicago represented.
Oh, it was an incredible spectacle.
Thank
And
you.
you picture it, Chicago, 1893. The fairgrounds were dazzling. They were this vision of the future with these magnificent buildings, electric lights everywhere. Remember, this was a novelty at the time. And there were exhibits from all over the globe. It truly captured the imagination of millions of visitors. It was like stepping into another world.
It does sound incredible, like something out of a movie. But then again, there's always another side to every story, another perspective, right?
Always. And in this case, while all these city folks and visitors were marveling at the wonders of the fair, for a lot of farmers, well, it wasn't exactly a cause for celebration. In fact, for many of them, it represented everything they distrusted about big cities like Chicago. The concentrated wealth, the growing political power, and this feeling that city folks were increasingly disconnected from the realities of rural life.
So you have this fascinating dynamic where this event, this fair that's meant to bring people together to celebrate progress, it actually ends up highlighting the growing divide between them, the opposite of what they intended.
Exactly. And it wasn't just this quiet resentment either. This was happening at the same time that the agrarian populist movement was really gaining momentum. And the fair, well, with all its emphasis on industry and big business, it just added fuel to their fire. They saw it as proof that the system was rigged against them, that the deck was stacked, and that they needed to fight back against the growing power of cities and corporations.
So in a way, the fair, even with the best of intentions, it becomes this catalyst for social and political upheaval.
It's true. It's one of those fascinating moments in history where something like a World's Fair, which on the surface seems pretty straightforward, can have these unintended consequences and actually end up shaping the future of a nation.
It makes you wonder, would that movement, that populist movement, would it have happened the way it did without the World's Fair? It's like Chicago was always at the heart of these massive shifts, whether they intended to be or not. They were a catalyst.
It's true. And speaking of massive shifts, there's one final layer to this story I think is really worth mentioning, and it's this. Chicago's influence, well, it wasn't just contained to the West. It wasn't even contained to the United States.
Wait, really? What do you mean? How is that even possible?
Think back to all those innovations we talked about. The grain elevators, the standardized grading system they pioneered, the revolution they sparked in the meatpacking industry, even those mail order catalogs. Those things, those uniquely Chicago creations, well, they didn't just stay put in Chicago, did they?
So what, they were shipping grain elevators across the world? I'm picturing a giant grain elevator on a ship.
Not quite, although
Not.
that would be a sight to see, wouldn't it? No, but the ideas behind those innovations, the systems Chicago developed, they spread like wildfire. Take their grading system for grain, for example. That became the model, literally, for how other commodity markets across the globe were organized. So suddenly you have the way the entire world traded grain being influenced by a city that just a few decades earlier was a tiny trading post on the edge of the prairie. It's mind-boggling when you think about
It
it.
really is. It's like the butterfly effect, but
Mhm.
for commerce and trade. Chicago, this city that most people at the time probably thought of as, well, a regional powerhouse at best, ends up shaping the global economy. That's incredible.
It is incredible. And it just goes to show how interconnected the world really is, how something that starts in one place can have these far-reaching, often unpredictable consequences. It's a good reminder that even the smallest actions can have a huge impact.
It really is. So as we wrap up this deep dive into the story of Chicago and the American West, what's the big takeaway? Why does this story, this one city's story, why does it still matter to us today?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? I think if there's one thing we can learn from Chicago, it's that cities are these incredibly powerful engines of change, both good and bad. They can drive economic growth, they can spark innovation, but they can also exacerbate inequality, put incredible strain on our natural resources, and in some cases, even disrupt traditional ways of life.
It's a bit of a cautionary tale then, but also a story about human ingenuity, ambition, and this drive to build something new, something better.
Exactly. And it's understanding this complex legacy, this push and pull between progress and its consequences, that can help us, I think, as we try to navigate the challenges we face in the 21st century. Think about the issues we grapple with today: urban development, sustainability, social equity. These are all issues that were shaped, in part, by cities like Chicago.
It's almost like we can look back at their successes, but also their failures, and hopefully chart a better path forward, right?
Exactly. Chicago's story, it's not just a history lesson, it's a roadmap, or maybe a set of signposts that can guide us as we try to create cities and societies that are more equitable, more sustainable, and ultimately more resilient. And that's a story worth telling, isn't it?
Absolutely. Well, we've covered a lot of ground today. From humble beginnings to global influence, Chicago's story is full of surprises. But if there's one thing I hope our listeners take away from all of this, it's this: never underestimate the power of a good idea. Because as Chicago proves, even the most far-fetched dreams can reshape the world, sometimes in ways we never could have imagined.
Well said. And sometimes those dreams, they even arrive on your doorstep in the form of a mail order catalog.
That's all the time we have for today's deep dive. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time for another fascinating journey into the past.